In 1932, a man in Detroit couldn't spare $1 for bullets, so he armed himself with a length of pipe, a strip of leather, and whatever the scrap heap would give him. Across America, the Great Depression turned desperate people into inventors. When banks failed and factories went dark, families still had to hunt for supper, guard what little they owned, and walk streets ruled by hunger. Guns cost money nobody had, so Americans made do. Number 9 on this list could put a rabbit on the table from 40 feet away and cost nothing but a dead bicycle. Number 3 was so common in mill towns that police stopped bothering to write it up. These 25 improvised tools tell the story of a generation that refused to go under. Let's count down, starting with number 25. Number 25, the sock and shot bag. The simplest weapon of the hard years began with a wool sock and a handful of lead, shot, buckshot, or river gravel poured into the toe and knotted tight. Night watchmen, boxcar riders, and boarding house tenants kept one within reach of the pillow. It cost nothing, hid inside a coat, and drew no attention from a beat cop who'd have confiscated a pistol on sight. Oral histories from railroad towns recall drifters weighting the toe with whatever the yard offered: nuts, bolts, a broken padlock. It was a poor man's answer to being jumped in the dark, quiet, and disposable. Toss the contents, and all that remained was laundry. For men who slept in flop houses and hobo jungles, it was less a weapon of aggression than a thin margin of safety in a country where the desperate preyed on the desperate. Number 24, files ground into blades. Every farm and every shuttered factory had a drawer of worn-out flat files, and in lean years those files became knives. The steel was already hardened, so a man with a grindstone and patience could shape a blade that held an edge better than anything sold cheap at the 5 and dime. Handles came from deer antler, scrap oak, or wrapped leather lace. Blacksmiths and out-of-work machinists did a quiet trade in them, trading a finished blade for eggs, coal, or a day's labor. The old file teeth often stayed visible along the spine, a maker's signature that told you the thing was born from something broken. These knives skinned game, cut rope, and when trouble came, served as protection. A store-bought hunting knife cost $1 or more. A ruined file cost a favor. Number 23, leaf spring choppers. When an automobile finally gave out and rusted behind the barn, the leaf springs beneath it were treasure. That was high-carbon steel, and rural smiths knew it would forge into a heavy chopping blade tougher than store stock. Across the Dust Bowl and the southern hills, the leaf spring became machete, corn knife, and camp blade all at once. Men heated it in a coal forge, hammered it flat, and tempered it in a bucket of used motor oil. Oral histories from Appalachia recall whole families whose only good cutting tools came off dead Model Ts. The work was hot and slow, but the result outlasted its maker. Some of those blades still turn up at estate sales, dark and pitted, the last useful piece of a car that carried a family west and then died. Number 22, the slungshot. Older than the Depression, but perfectly suited to it, the slungshot was a heavy weight, a lead ball, a large nut, a smooth stone, braided into the end of a short cord or leather thong. Sailors had carried them for a century. Now dock workers, striking men, and city toughs carried them too. It swung with brutal speed, folded flat into a pocket, and looked like nothing at all until it moved. Police in port cities loathed it precisely because it was so easy to hide and so hard to prove. A confiscated slungshot was just a rock and a string in an evidence drawer. For men walking home through rough districts after a long shift, it was cheap insurance, made in 10 minutes from the contents of any scrap bin. Number 21. Bicycle chain whips. When a bicycle rusted past saving, its chain lived on. Wrapped at one end with tape or wire for a grip, a length of greasy chain became a flexible, frightening thing that whistled through the air and left no doubt about intentions. In tenement neighborhoods and rail yards, young men carried them looped under a belt or coiled in a jacket. The weapon required no craftsmanship, only a wrench to break the links free. Its reputation did much of the work. The rattle alone could clear a doorway. Social workers of the era wrote uneasily about the improvised arsenals of idle, jobless youth, and the chain appeared again and again in their reports. It was the sound of a decade with too many young men and not enough work to keep their hands busy. Number 20. Cast brass knuckles from melted scrap. With foundries closed and men who knew metal sitting idle, homemade brass knuckles poured out of backyard crucibles. Old plumbing fittings, drawer pulls, melted down toys, anything with enough metal went into a ladle over a coal fire and then into a scratched sand mold. The castings came out rough and were filed smooth on a bench grinder. They were heavy, ugly, and effective, and they cost nothing but the courage to work molten metal in a shed. Police blotters from industrial cities logged them by the hundreds. For a man who couldn't afford a pistol and couldn't risk the sentence one carried, a fistful of poured metal was the pure compromise. It stayed in a coat pocket, silent and legal-looking, until the moment it wasn't. Number 19. The trench knife inheritance. Many Depression households still had a father or uncle's souvenirs from the Great War, and among them were knuckle-guard trench knives brought home from France. As money vanished, these relics came down off the mantle and back into daily carry. Where the originals had rusted or been lost, home tinkerers copied them, a blade riveted to a shaped grip with a bar across the knuckles. The design fused two weapons into one and carried the grim authority of a war people still remembered. Veterans of 1918, now standing in breadlines, understood better than anyone how thin the line was between order and chaos. The trench knife's return to American pockets in the 1930s was a quiet admission that the peace those men had been promised had not, in the end, arrived. Number 18. Ice picks. Before the electric refrigerator conquered the American kitchen, every home had an ice box, and every ice box needed an ice pick, a slender steel spike in a wooden handle, sold for pennies at any hardware store. In the Depression, it became one of the most common weapons in urban America precisely because it was innocent. No law could touch a man for carrying a kitchen tool. Yet in a crowded tenement quarrel or a back alley robbery, that harmless spike turned lethal. Police in New York and Chicago came to dread it. It left a wound like nothing else and could be dropped down a sewer grate in a second. The ice pick's terrible usefulness lay entirely in its ordinariness, a weapon that spent 99 days out of 100 doing honest work, chipping a block for the lemonade. Number 17. Straight razors. Every barber shop ran on the straight razor, and every man who couldn't afford a barber owned one for shaving at the kitchen sink. Folded, it was grooming. Open, it was one of the most feared weapons of the era. It cost little, held a murderous edge, and vanished into a vest pocket. Court records from the 1930s are thick with cases involving them, and the razor took on a dark mystique in the music and slang of the time. For the poor, it was simply what they had, a tool of daily life that could, in a bad moment, become something else. That double life defined the improvised arsenal of the decade. Almost nothing on this list was built to be a weapon. It was the desperation of the times that reached into the toolbox and gave ordinary objects a second, sharper purpose. Number 16. Lead pipe saps wrapped in tape. A short length of plumbing pipe, a rag or leather wrap around one end for grip, and a decade's worth of frustration. That was the whole recipe. As buildings were abandoned and salvaged, pipe was everywhere for the taking. Wrapped and pocketed, it became the truncheon of the jobless, carried by men riding freights and picketing gates. Its plainness was its genius. A pipe is a pipe until it's swung. Labor histories of the era describe both strikers and hired strikebreakers armed this way, the confrontations turning ugly in the shadow of factory walls. The lead pipe became shorthand in newspapers for street violence precisely because it was so available and so anonymous. In a nation stripping its own dead industries for parts, even the plumbing became a means of self-defense. Number 15. Nail-studded clubs. In rural districts and hobo camps, the crudest weapon of all was also among the most honest. A stout stick, a length of table leg, or a broken axe handle driven through with nails or spikes. It required no skill, only anger and a hammer. Riding the rails was dangerous work, and the men who did it faced railroad guards, thieves, and each other. A studded club, leaned by the fire of a jungle camp, was a statement that a man would not be taken easily. These weapons rarely survived. They were made in an hour and abandoned when the camp moved on. But they appear again and again in the memoirs of those who rode the boxcars in search of work, a blunt symbol of how far the country had fallen from the prosperity it had promised. Number 14. Sharpened farm tools. When banks foreclosed and sheriffs came to auction a family's land, the countryside did not always go quietly. Across the farm belt, men gathered at foreclosure sales carrying the tools of their trade: pitchforks, hay hooks, corn knives, and scythes, freshly ground and held a little too tightly. The penny auction resistance movements of the early 1930s turned these implements into symbols of defiance, sometimes of open confrontation. A pitchfork was a pitchfork, impossible to outlaw, and yet a wall of them at a courthouse door sent an unmistakable message. Oral histories from Iowa and Nebraska recall neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, tools in hand, daring the auctioneer to proceed. The land itself had armed them. In the hardest years, the same hook that pulled hay could just as easily hold a line against the men come to take everything. Number 13. Snares, gigs, and poaching gear. Hunger drove a quiet war between hungry families and the game wardens sworn to stop them. Store-bought ammunition was a luxury, so people took game silently instead. Wire snares twisted from fence and telephone line, fish gigs forged from old tines, deadfall traps built from logs and stone. It was illegal, and everyone knew it, and everyone did it anyway. A rabbit in a snare or a fish on a gig meant the difference between a fed family and an empty table. Wardens of the era wrote of an entire countryside poaching to survive, of finding snares strung through the woods faster than they could pull them. These were weapons against starvation itself, made from wire and desperation. For a great many rural Americans, the skill of taking game without a gunshot was simply the skill of staying alive. Number 12. Homemade slingshots from inner tubes. When the family car's tires wore through, the rubber inner tube inside was cut into strips of stretchy, powerful elastic, and in the hands of a boy, that rubber became a hunting weapon. Lashed to a forked branch or a bent wire frame, it launched stones and steel ball bearings, hard enough to drop birds and small game. For countless Depression-era children, the slingshot was the first weapon they ever owned and the first meat they ever brought home. It cost nothing, made no noise to alert a warden, and used ammunition that lay free on any gravel road. Fathers taught sons to make them. The good shots earned real respect. Behind the boyhood fun was a serious purpose. A sparrow or a squirrel taken with a lucky stone was protein, and in those years, protein was not something a family took lightly. Number 11, the wrist rocket's ancestor. A step up from the forked stick slingshot was the wire-framed catapult bent from heavy fencing or coat hanger stock into a Y that braced against the forearm for a steadier, harder pull. Older boys and grown men built these for serious small game hunting, pairing them with the same inner tube rubber and a leather pouch cut from an old shoe tongue. The added leverage sent a ball bearing with surprising force. In regions where even shotgun shells were an unthinkable expense, a well-made wire catapult was a genuine provider. Rural memoirs recall men who could reliably take rabbits and even pheasant with one. It was silent, cheap, endlessly reusable, and entirely legal to carry, a hunting tool disguised as a child's toy, feeding families who had run clean out of other options. Number 10, bolus and weighted throwing lines. Borrowed from ranching traditions of the Southwest and Latin America, the bola, 2 or 3 weights joined by cords, found new life among Depression hunters, chasing birds and small game across open country. The weights were anything heavy and roundish: fishing sinkers, cast lead, stones sewn into leather. Thrown correctly, it wrapped a bird's wings or an animal's legs and brought it down without a shot or a wasted shell. It took real practice, and the men who mastered it were prized in their communities. In the cattle regions, where the tool was already part of daily life, hard times simply pointed it at supper. Like so much on this list, the bola asked only for scrap and skill and returned food for the table. In a decade defined by scarcity, that trade was one people made gladly. Number 9, homemade crossbows. Perhaps the most ambitious hunters built crossbows, and the raw material of choice was, once again, the automobile, a leaf spring for the bow, a wooden stock hand-carved from a plank, and cord or wire for the string. It was slow, heavy, and demanded genuine craftsmanship, but it launched a bolt in near silence and used ammunition a man could make and recover himself. For those willing to invest the time, a crossbow meant hunting deer without the crack of a rifle to draw a warden's attention. Rural tinkerers took quiet pride in these builds, and a good one was a family heirloom. It represented the highest expression of Depression ingenuity, taking the corpse of a broken machine and, with patience and salvage, turning it into a tool that could feed a household through a winter when the store shelves and the wallet were both bare. Number 8, the billy club, carved and loaded. Wood was free, and a man with a knife and a winter evening could carve a serviceable billy club or blackjack from a length of hardwood, hickory, or oak, by preference, for their weight. The ambitious drilled out the head and poured in melted lead to give it authority, then wrapped the grip in cord for a sure hold. Watchmen, shopkeepers, and householders kept them behind counters and beside doors. Unlike a pistol, a wooden club carried no legal peril and needed no ammunition that cost money. Whittling one was a common enough pastime that few thought it remarkable. Yet, in a decade of break-ins, by the desperate and the hungry, a loaded club within arm's reach was, for many families, the whole of their home defense. It asked nothing of them but a scrap of firewood and a few quiet hours. Number 7. Padlock and chain flails. A heavy padlock knotted into the end of a length of chain or rope made a swinging weapon of real menace, and every item in it could be found in a scrap heap or hanging useless on an abandoned gate. Rail riders and dockmen favored it for the same reasons they favored the slungshot. It hid easily and destroyed nothing but the man on the other end. Swung, the padlock arrived with the full force of the arm behind it. Broken apart, it was only a lock and a chain. Again, innocent as anything, its appearance in police records of the era speaks to a hard truth of the times. The country was full of men on the move with nothing to lose and every reason to protect the little they carried. The scrap heap armed them quietly and completely and asked no questions. Number 6. Hat pins and improvised spikes. Women of the era were not defenseless, and the long, sharp hat pin, a genuine fashion necessity in the age of large hats, doubled as a discreet and legal means of protection. A woman walking home alone through a rough district could carry 6 inches of steel in plain sight, disguised as vanity. The hat pin panics of earlier decades had already established its reputation, and hard times only sharpened the need. Beyond the hat pin, women improvised with knitting needles, sharpened combs, and pins of every kind, small, silent tools that raised no eyebrow and drew no arrest. In a decade when desperation pushed some men to prey on anyone weaker, these quiet spikes gave working women a measure of control over their own safety. They were weapons hidden in ordinary life, carried by people the history books too often forget were also fighting to survive. Number 5. Thrown lie, pepper, and ash. The oldest trick of the cornered and the poor was to blind an attacker, and the Depression kitchen was full of the means. A handful of lye, a fistful of ground pepper, a scoop of wood ash or hot stove cinders flung into the eyes. Any of them bought a few precious seconds to run or fight. Shopkeepers kept a tin of pepper beneath the register. Women kept a twist of it in a pocket. None of it could be outlawed because all of it lived honestly in the pantry. Oral histories record the tactic passed quietly between neighbors as common sense, mother to daughter. It was crude, and it was effective, and it cost less than a penny. In a country where the law couldn't protect everyone, and a gun was out of reach, the humble spice rack became, for many, the last line of defense. Number 4. Boiling water and the stovetop defense. For a family barricaded in a tenement or a farmhouse against an intruder, the kettle on the stove was a weapon, always at the ready. A pot of boiling water, thrown from a top landing or a doorway, was a devastating deterrent that no law could ever forbid and no money was needed to buy. Housewives of the era spoke of it plainly as a fact of home defense, the same way they'd speak of locking a door. In crowded buildings where robberies were common and police response was slow, the stove offered protection to people who had nothing else. It required no skill and no permit, only nerve and a full kettle. That the ordinary act of heating water for tea could in an instant become a household's salvation says everything about the improvised survival of the age. Number 3. The tape-wrapped sap glove. In the mill towns and factory districts, working men made gloves with authority built in. A leather work glove with lead shot, sand, or metal filing sewn into a pouch across the knuckles. It looked, at a glance, like nothing more than a laborer's hand covering, which is exactly why it was so common that police in some towns stopped bothering to write it up. A man wore it openly, walked past a patrolman, and no one blinked. Yet a fist inside one landed like a hammer. It was cheap, entirely concealed in plain sight, and legal enough to argue over in court. For men who worked with their hands and settled disputes the same way, the loaded glove was the perfect depression weapon, a tool of the trade and a means of protection folded into a single, ordinary object nobody could take away. Number 2, the reforged bayonet and war surplus steel. The Great War had flooded America with surplus military hardware, and by the 1930s, a bayonet could be had cheaply at an Army surplus store or pulled from a veteran's trunk. Cut down and rehandled, it made a formidable knife. Left long, it made a spear lashed to a broom handle for guarding a home or a camp. Enterprising men reworked this surplus steel into all manner of blades, trading on the fact that it was already hardened and abundant. There was a grim symmetry to it. The weapons of a war fought to end all wars, now defending Americans against the enemies of hunger and crime at home. Veterans handled this steel with a familiarity that unsettled their neighbors. It was a reminder that the country had asked these men to fight once already and then left them to fend for themselves. Number 1, the zip gun, and the danger nobody advertised. At the top of the list stands the most notorious improvised weapon of the era, the crude, single-shot firearm cobbled together from pipe, wood, and salvaged hardware by those who could afford neither a real gun nor the trouble of buying one legally. Its very existence is a testament to how far desperation pushed people. But here is the truth the legend leaves out. The zip gun was a menace to the person holding it. These devices had no real safety, no reliable aim, and a terrible habit of bursting apart when fired, maiming the hand that built them. Police and coroners of the era recorded far more zip gun accidents than successful crimes. It was less a weapon than a gamble with one's own fingers. The zip gun tops this list not for its effectiveness, but for what it symbolizes. A generation so cornered by poverty that some would risk everything, even their own hands, just to hold a little power in a powerless time. Across all 25 entries, one thread runs through every knotted sock, ground-down file, and salvaged leaf spring. A nation stripping its own broken machines and empty pantries for the means to survive. Some of these tools fed families, some guarded doorways, and a few crossed lines the law had drawn. But all of them were born from the same hard arithmetic: hunger on one side, an empty wallet on the other, and human ingenuity stubbornly refusing to let the equation end in surrender. The Depression didn't just teach Americans to go without. It taught them to make do, to make it themselves, and to make something from the wreckage of everything that had failed them. Which of these surprised you the most? Drop a comment and let me know. And if this reminded you of a story your own grandparents used to tell, I'd love to hear it below.